Introduction. Welcome to the Church of the Jesuits. This temple, which is dedicated to Toledo's patron Saint Ildefonsus, immediately grabs your attention for its impressive facade. Saint Ildefonsus was the Archbishop of Toledo, a man of Hispanic origin who died in 667. Even though his remains don't reside in the city but in Zamora, Saint Ildefonsus is deeply revered because he is one of the central figures of the miracle of the imposition of the chasuble, when Our Lady came down from heaven to dress Saint Ildefonsus in praise for protecting her maidenhood, constantly attacked by heretics. The Jesuits settled in Toledo in 1558 after the death of Archbishop Juan Martino Silicio. They settled in what is now the El Salvador Square, where they opened their first temple in 1562. In 1569, the Jesuits bought land that belonged to José Hurtado del Mendoza, a descendant of the Lord of Orgaz, to build a Jesuit-style church, although they ran out of money for its construction. It is said this temple rises above the house where Saint Ildefonsus was born. Consequently, brothers Estefania and Pedro Manrique de Castilla decided to spend their inheritance constructing this temple to honor their patron saint, which they would hand over to the Society of Jesus. After the death of Don Pedro Manrique in 1602, they received the support they needed from Doña Estefania to start building the temple. It's thanks to her generous donation that we can admire this Toledo jewel, which was designed by Juan Bautista Manegro and erected by the Jesuit Pedro Sanchez. Thus, they began to bring in the necessary materials in 1628. In 1669, Toledo architect Bartolomé Sambigo y Salceda completed the second section of the facade, the chapels, and the naves at the height of the cornices. Work halted several times until it was finally finished in 1765, 2 years before Carlos III expelled the Jesuits from all Spanish territories, including those overseas. Facade. Now, go outside for a moment. The towers appear as though they want to direct our gaze toward the heavens. These consist of 3 sections of varying height. The bays are larger in the last section to lighten the load, thus saving their strength for the lower section. The shields of Manrique can be seen over the windows of the first section. Stone was used to construct the first section of the towers, while brick is in use for the second and the third. Stone is also used in the window frames of the second section and the corners and the cornices of the third. Construction was completed in 1701. The facade consists of 2 segments of differing heights, topped by a garret alcove. 3 divisions run along the front with 3 corresponding doors, the central one being the focal point. The structure is supported by 4 columns in each section, a highly innovative order that replaces the Doric. In the lower section, St. Francis Xavier and St. Francis Borgia appear in the lateral niches. In the second section, we can see representations of St. Aloysius Gonzaga and St. Stanislaw Kostka. And in the garret, St. Ignatius of Loyola tops off the sculptural set under a small temple that leads in an ascending direction toward the facade. All of the sculptures are made of black marble from San Pablo de los Montes, Toledo, except for the hands and head, which are of white marble. The set is completed with the relief on the main door that represents the miracle of the imposition of chasuble to Saint Ildefonsus. Central nave. Now come back inside and look towards the front. The Jesuit church has a Latin cross plan and consists of a single central nave flanked by 8 chapels that precede the transept. The Jesuit school of Alcalá de Henares inspired the construction of the church. The side chapels open in semicircular arches flanked by pairs of pilasters. Among them are alcoves that house the sculptures of Herman López de Mejía, which represent the 12 apostles, St. Peter, and St. Barnabas. Monegro was in charge of putting the capitals and entablatures on the pilasters, as well as the corbels and the modillions, which is the protruding plasterwork that adorns the bottom of the cornices. The windows tear away from the entablatures, allowing light to penetrate inside the temple. The barrel vault divides into segments through the placement of transverse arches that start from the double pilasters. The entire set is made of exposed brick, although you can't see this inside because it's been painted with plaster. One. The Chapel of St. Francis Borgia. When visitors came through the door, they must have been surprised by the downcast face of St. Francis Borgia and the skull. These reside in the first of many altarpieces we will see during our walk. St. Francis, the Duke of Gandia, had been declared the great equerry of Isabella of Portugal. Upon her death, he organized a procession to move her remains from Toledo to Granada for her burial. When he had to corroborate the identity of the deceased and saw her badly decomposed face, he said, "I swear to never again serve a lord that can die," thus surrendering to faith. Upon becoming a widower, he entered the Society of Jesus as an itinerant preacher. Due to his unwavering faith, he was appointed the Father General of the entire order. The first chapel looks imposing with its painted gold and red wood. Vicente Alonso designed this altarpiece of the late Baroque period. The estipet columns stand out, which are the columns that are narrower at the base that we'll see in the original altarpieces of this church. Two. The Chapel of the Crucified Blessed Christ. The altarpiece of the Crucified Blessed Christ dates back to the 18th century, as do the other altarpieces in the church. However, the Christ, which Domingo Beltran crafted, is from 1580. This sculpture is interesting for its poignancy as it represents profound moral suffering, which was prevalent at the time. The Virgin and its accompanying St. John come from the Tomei workshop. 3. The Chapel of St. Francis Xavier. In the altarpiece dedicated to St. Francis Xavier, a Jesuit and the patron saint of the missionaries, the saint is seen in the throes of death on the Chinese island of Sancian. 4. The Chapel of Our Lady of Fatima. The Chapel of Our Lady of Fatima contains the oldest altarpiece in the church, and could have once housed the image of Our Lady of Peace, which has long disappeared. It's unique as an altarpiece, smaller than the others and with entirely different decorative elements. Made of gilded wood in the 16th century, we see a faint hint of Baroque in it, though it is more in line with the counter-reformist spirit. The paintings in the side divisions of the altarpiece tell us of the life of the Virgin. 15. The Chapel of the Immaculate. The Chapel of the Immaculate is relatively modern except for the altarpiece, which is very similar to the others in the church. It was built in the 18th century in a Baroque style. Accompanying it on the right is the patron saint of the city, Saint Leocadia. It is the only chapel with a vault decorated with pictorial motifs, in this case with the tetramorph. 16. The Chapel of Our Lady of Sorrows. In the center of the altarpiece, a sword pierces Our Lady of Sorrows' heart, which is the same sword Simeon prophesied would break her heart because of her son. 17. The Chapel of St. Ignatius of Loyola. We now stand before one of the most remarkable altarpieces, which houses the founder of the Society of Jesus, St. Ignatius of Loyola. The display of the alcove that houses his remains show us a Rococo piece. St. Ignatius served as an army captain. After getting injured, he spent his recovery getting closer to God by reading spiritual literature. Later, he studied in Paris, where he met Francis Xavier. Then, in 1540, he founded the Society of Jesus in Rome. A year later, he was elected first general of the order. (18) The Chapel of the Christ of the Martyrs. We're now in the Chapel of the Christ of the Martyrs. Previously, the chapel was presided over by another Jesuit saint, Saint Aloysius Gonzaga. His image was transferred to the primary vestibule so that the present-day Christ could be installed. 5. The altarpiece of St. John the Baptist. Much like the one facing it, this altarpiece isn't an original of the Jesuit Church. Rather, it was moved here from the church of the parish of St. John the Baptist, which was tragically destroyed. This transfer occurred in the years following the expulsion of the Jesuits and replaced the originals, which had been assembled by Diego de Luna. Solomonic columns on high pedestals flank the single-segment altarpiece. In its only division, we see a painting made in 1702 by a deaf and mute artist from Madrid, Alonso del Arco, which represents the baptism of Christ. 6. The Holy Spirit Chapel, Ochavo. This piece is of great artistic interest. A rectangular antechapel and an elongated octagonal reliquary chapel that uses the ochavo of the cathedral as a model. Although it may not seem like it, the walls are made of brick rather than marble. The red color of the painting stands out, which symbolizes the blood of Christ. 7. Reliquary. Look to your right and you'll see the relics in full view, which are protected by a gilded wood reliquary. Little is known about these as most of their records have been lost, but you can still read about who they once belonged to. Under the reliquary, you can see the tomb of two very important Jesuits, both in Toledo and in Spain as a whole. Father Juan de Mariana, a Talaverian historian who wrote the first general history of Spain. The second, the priest Jeronimo de Rapalda, was the author of the Catechism. 8. The Chapel of Our Lady of Perpetual Help. The altarpiece that presides over this chapel is an alcove housing Our Lady of Perpetual Help by Herman Lopez de Mejia. The Virgin threatens with a dart the dragon that tries to devour the soul she holds. 19. The Dome and the Transept. The transept and the dome were finished after the completion of the primary nave. The dome was designed by Hernandez Sierra in 1752, although it wasn't included in the original design. In 1755, slate slabs brought over from the mountain of Guadalupe were placed over the hemispherical of the dome. A copper ball topped with an iron cross was placed on the dome, which you can see from the towers. The timbre on which the dome rests was made of brick in an octagonal shape on the outside and coated in plaster in a cylindrical shape on the inside. Inside, under the timbre, are triangular and concave sections called penitentives. Each of the four penitentives houses the shields of the patrons Pedro and Estefania Manrique de Castilla, which were made by Pedro de Luna. 10. The Main Chapel. The consecration of the church occurred in 1718. Construction stopped, and the cult began worshiping that year, which they continued right up into the expulsion of the Jesuits. For the consecration, the main nave was closed with a wall that allowed the cult to worship on a provisional altarpiece near the transept. Construction resumed again in 1752. 12. The altarpiece of the main chapel.